And good evening all for module 3 of our 4-part series. We had some wonderful discussions in part 1 and part 2. Part 1 more about investing principles. Part 2 we had a lot of arithmetic, and I hope you had a chance to see the YouTube video, particularly with a view to download the Excel files that I had discussed here. So they are all available in the description box, as well as links to various other videos. So do explore that. As I had mentioned, module 3 and module 4 is going to be more focused on equity investing. In module 4, I will talk about, how do we manage the equity risk? How do we create defensive strategies? So those aspects I'm going to discuss in the next Saturday session. But today we'll talk some fundamentals about equity investing. We'll also talk about, in my view, which are the common mistakes that happen. The mistake I had also done, and I will tell you my story today, right? So in terms of the severe challenge that I had created for myself, and how I managed to get out of it is something I'll share more in detail in the next session. So warm welcome, and essentially what we are going to discuss today to begin with are the primary reasons why we invest in equities. In session 1, we had talked about this fact that if we are able to allocate more and more of our savings to equity, we can improve the weighted average return. So there are two things here. One is, what is the return that you can generate on your equity portfolio? But that's not sufficient, because if you have only a 20% allocation to equity, even if you are generating a 30% return on your portfolio, that's not really going to help, because it's just 20% of your overall portfolio. So what really matters is the weighted average on your investment, not how much returns you are generating on equity portfolio, which is what we had seen in session 1. So therefore, one of the underlying themes of what I'm going to talk about today as well as in the next session is, how do we gradually improve and increase our allocation to equities. So as I had shared with you, personally, out of my entire investment, I'm 96% into equities. Only 2% in fixed income, 2% in gold. That's it. But this 96% journey, and I'm sure some of you already have some exposure of this level, but the point I'm making is that this is not something that we have to achieve without application of our mind. We need to actually achieve it in a step-by-step way. But the point is, if you are able to increase your allocation and simultaneously create strategies to improve your return, then you have two benefits coming your way. One is your equity return is improving, and secondly, your overall portfolio return is improving. So we have to actually keep both these objectives in mind. So the whole discussion that I have in session 3 and session 4 is around both these objectives. Quite often the discussions that happen around equity investing are only focused on improving equity return. But not much discussion happens on how do we improve the allocation to equity as an asset class. And for us to do that, as I had clarified in session 1 itself, people sometimes think that those who invest more in equity are more risk-taking, right? And those who keep money in fixed deposits are risk-averse. And I had clarified this, that I am extremely risk-averse individual, right? While, I do take risks, as I was just sharing with my cousin, I play leather ball cricket at an age which is not an age to play leather ball cricket. I had my own mishaps while playing cricket, including leg injury, and my middle finger got dislocated when I was trying to take a catch at a tender age of 55. So, and I continue to play cricket. So I am risk-taking by nature, But when it comes to equity investing, I am very defensive because it is a question of hard-earned money, and I am the only earning engine in the family. My next generation is just about to get into it. So I have to ensure that I can't be wildly risk-taking. I have to be very defensive. So all these strategies I had to create were also based on my anecdotal experience of burning my fingers very badly when I began with my equity investing journey, about which I'll share with you today. So no more suspense, right? And that's why I had to create these strategies which help me to manage risk on one hand, and on the other hand, increase the allocation to equities. So we have to achieve both these objectives. So primary reason for investing in equities is the tremendous possibility of capital appreciation and compounding. So this is something we should never forget. So whenever we create strategies, the focus has to be about the growth potential. Dividend is a nice byproduct to have. Dividend is also a good way of de-risking. Now, in session 1, I had also mentioned this, that when it comes to compounding and you are investing in mutual funds, I always recommend that you invest in growth schemes, not in dividend schemes, for the simple reason that when you have a choice of growth and dividend, you should not let money come into your bank account and let it compound only at 3.5 or 4% when you have the potential of compounding it at a much higher rate. So it doesn't make sense that you receive dividend and let it compound at a lower rate. But in case of shares, you don't have a choice. And we, of course, in the next session, we'll talk about dividend policy and the impact, etc. Next time, we'll also talk about bonus, split, buyback, and all those aspects which are involved in typical equity investing, apart from some of the other aspects which I'm going to elaborate, right? But the point is that in case of shares, I have a slightly different view on dividend as compared to dividends from a mutual fund. Because dividend from a mutual fund, you have a choice of growth versus dividend, where you must definitely go for growth, right? But in case of shares, dividend is a good byproduct. Dividend is also a way of de-risking. Why do I say it's a good way of de-risking? There are two ways you can take cash out of the market. One is you actually sell shares. The other is you receive dividend, right? And of course, third is the buyback. This is the third, but which is more of an exception. It happens once in a while, and you have no control on it. So to that extent, you receiving dividend is a good idea because it helps you to de-risk. It helps you to take money out of the market, right? But at the same time, when it comes to equity investing per se, we should be more driven by growth, is what I would like to submit. Today, we will also look at a framework about which are the aspects which can continue to improve or assure us about a certain growth potential of a company. Now, again, as usual, I'll give you a quick flavor of that. And those who are interested, I have a video on it which explains that framework through almost a 35-minute video. So those who want to listen to it piece by piece, you're most welcome. I'll again give you the video link in the description box. But I'll do give you a flavor in terms of which are the important aspects which are very critical for us to understand when it comes to equity investing. The next point is the profits, therefore. Now, again, we have seen a lot of IPOs where the arguments for valuation are not necessarily driven by profits. Some of them are reporting losses, and yet they are coming out with IPOs. So that's a different dynamic. Maybe as a part of Q&A, we can discuss that. But essentially, what we have to be also focused are some important parameters as if we are running that business. So as I'm going to talk about certain secondary advantages or secondary reasons because of which we invest in equities, that time again I'll touch upon this. But essentially, we have to be very cautious that whatever investment decisions we are taking are out of a conviction about the value and growth potential, not based on hearsay, not based on somebody's recommendation. It is our conviction that matters. So how do we build that conviction? We'll anyway talk about, right? Coming to these secondary reasons, one of the interesting ways of getting a sense of ownership is investing in equities. So you may be an employee somewhere and you may not be able to set up your own business, But by taking a stake in a company, you have that sense of ownership. And I take liberties with that sense of ownership. So I send my recommendations, I send questions. Of course, not breaching the public, non-public information, which is a very important line. I don't expect a company to divulge any non-public information to me. But more probing questions, attending AGMs, as if it's your own company, is not a bad idea. Because I have seen in my experience, either it helps you to take wise decisions for protecting your own money, or sometimes your recommendations can work for the better of a company, right? About which I'll make a reference next time. So sense of ownership is something very interesting. The second very important thing is the flexibility that we have, right? And the flexibility is, so normally what happens is, as we're going to discuss today, the importance of information in respect of assessing value. Because finally, as always we say in investing, and I'm going to elaborate this more today, investing is about value versus price. Now, value is a subject matter of information. If you are better informed, you can have a better assessment of value. If you are least informed, you can't make a good assessment of value. As simple as that. Now, the interesting thing is that the people who are insiders have better access to information than me as a retail investor I have, right? But the good thing is, so that's a clear disadvantage for me. But the advantage for me is that I am not wedded to that share, right? Which is not a choice that a promoter has. Promoter, unless the circumstances are too extreme, is quite wedded to that share. But that's a flexibility I have. And I must use that flexibility to my advantage. If in my assessment, the things are not going as good as I would expect from a value creation perspective, there's no harm for me to get out of an investment. I don't have to be emotionally involved like what a promoter would do. So I have a sense of ownership without the emotional overhang of that ownership, which is a great advantage to have if you think about it, right? Third is high liquidity. Unlike real estate, where we can't just sell a bedroom of our flat and keep the rest of the flat, here we have the flexibility of only selling 20% of our holding or 80% of our holding, depending on what we want. So it is a high amount of liquidity. But there are some exceptions also. Like what we saw during the COVID situation, there were back-to-back lower circuits, which means there was only selling pressure and you couldn't exit from an investment, even if you wanted to, right? In a way, these kinds of lower circuits also help in people taking a more rational decision rather than, trying to be a part of a herd and trying to exit somehow in desperation, right? So they play a very constructive role. So except those situations, there is a high liquidity which is available for our exit, right? And one very interesting thing, and I'll elaborate on this next time. I have already created a video about this. One very interesting thing which I have experienced is the wonderful opportunities that the market throws because of mispricing. And I'll elaborate on this a little later, right? What is this mispricing business and how it actually throws wonderful opportunities for us to take advantage of, right? Which is something we will discuss. A few thoughts on what are the critical success factors. In my view, again, my experience is last 12 years or so. There are some of you may be more experienced. But in my view, what are the critical success factors in equity investing? To my mind, the most important one is understanding and managing risks. I don't know whether I mentioned this in the first session. Quite often, the mistake which is done is that we have target returns and we run after those returns, right? I take a little counterintuitive view to this and I say that you manage risks well, returns are a byproduct, right? So this may look a little funny because obviously we want higher returns and that's typically a driver. But I'm saying something which is counterintuitive, which is you learn to manage those risks, and once you learn to manage those risks, returns are a result. You don't have to worry about the returns. If you do right things in terms of managing risk, returns are going to happen. A simple example, COVID created a situation of a very rapid collapse in the market. 45%, 50% collapse in the market just in 1 month. Now, if I am able to manage the risk arising out of fear, fear makes us take wrong decisions. Now, this is a big risk when I'm investing in markets. How do I manage that risk? I must have an answer, right? This is that risk that I fell a prey the first time. So now let me tell you this story, right? So I began investing seriously, equity investing in 2006. Though I worked in investment banking industry, which is closely associated with equity investing, I had very busy time. So I didn't want to get into any kind of equity investing that time. Some public issues in the 80s, 90s apart, and some shares that you have got in very small quantity. But I started investing in 2006. Prior to that, I was pursuing a doctoral program with IIT Bombay beginning from 2004, and it would take about 5.5 years. So I had sold 3 flats of mine before the rally in the real estate market happened. 2 were in Thane, 1 was in Powai, right, in Raheja Vihar. So I had sold 3 flats for a paltry sum. And as I told you, one of the most important things that I have realized is that 80% of your return happens by understanding the market. 20% is a top-up by identifying individual assets, right, within that market. So I had very scant understanding of the market forces, right? So as a result, because I didn't want to have too much of overheads in terms of expenses running, I didn't want to rent it out, I sold 3 properties before the real estate rally, which was a wrong thing to do. That was first. And whatever money I had received out of those proceeds, that was the loss I booked in 2008-2009 in the Lehman Brothers crisis. So I had lost 3 flats, which potentially would have gone up at least 5-6 times by then. And on top of it, whatever was the proceeds received, I'm saying, I'm not talking about gain. I didn't make any gain on those flats. That entire amount of proceeds was lost in 2008-2009. Because I was in the midst of my PhD program, and in our School of Management, we used to say that you're not worth a PhD unless you really get 2 depressions on the way, right? You're not really done good work, right? So that's the kind of journey that you have. I had stopped earning completely, and then fear hit me, right? And because of that fear, I took a wrong decision of selling my stocks at a completely wrong time. So I fell prey to the fear part, right? Now more severe impact came in a very short period during COVID, right? Because I had now learned about the markets, I actually took advantage of that fear. So it is our choice of whether we want to be on the wrong side of fear or whether we want to be on the right side of fear. So one of the things that we can learn gradually is to be on the right side of fear by creating strategies which will help you to manage your equity risk. That's why I was saying earlier that once you manage risk, now those of you who have not sold during the COVID pandemic, see the amount of returns that you would have done from that bottom. And those who would have sold would be now really repenting, like I repented for a few years after 2008, 2009. So it took me a couple of years to recover those losses, and thereafter I've been compounding extremely well. Because I learned this hard way. And the reason I'm actually doing these workshops is for the simple reason that people don't suffer what I suffered from. That's the whole objective of this. So the critical success factor in my view, therefore, is understanding and managing these risks and creating strategies around them, about which I'll elaborate. So now the question for me that time was that I had 2 choices. One was to run away from equity markets, which like most people then start blaming the market, saying that this is a speculator's den. You know, it's brokers do this, dealers do this, traders do this, speculators do this, etc. And one could run away from the market, or could say that I have to analyze what went wrong in my own investing strategy and then correct it. So I took the second choice of correcting my mistakes, and that's how I gradually built a method which helped me to manage my mind monkey better. It is the mind monkey which is at play when we talk about greed and fear, and I'll explain to you next time the strategy I created in terms of creating a more defensive way of investing, right? Apart from analyzing the stocks that I had in a much better way, creating a leaner portfolio. So all those aspects we are going to talk about. One thing I have realized, if you analyze any game, whether it's cricket or individual games, typically games are won by players and teams which make the least amount of mistakes. Right? Do you agree with me? So you have on both sides great players, right? We saw what happened in the match of Pakistan, right? There was one error at a very important juncture, and then the bowler also went completely out of rhythm, right? And he was tossed for three sixes, one after the other by Australians. So essentially, how do we avoid our mistakes is the critical thing. Once we do that, the return automatically happens. The third important thing is reduce the noise in the information that we get. Now we get a lot of information, right? I jocularly say that after I reading business newspapers and I have stopped seeing the business channels, I have started making better money, right? Now why does this happen? Because when you get overload of information, it starts creating noise in your mind, right? Now some of which may be planted, some of which may be genuine. We are not able to filter it. Sometimes I have seen that some great investment banks or research analysts actually give a sell rating on a stock, right? Now I don't know how much regulators have the ability of analyzing who has given the sell rating and what have they done post that sell rating in terms of their own investment behavior. Now it is quite possible that the idea is to create supply in the market, right? So we give credibility to certain names, and because so and so said so, right, we act on it. It's not based on our conviction. Now this is an example of the noise in information, right? So this noise, if we start falling prey to, one of the reasons why I booked a lot of those losses is because he's still a very good friend of mine. I had a broking account with him apart from others, and every time I would call him, he would say that people are saying the market is going to collapse further, and he would give me a lower target. Now, that fear got fed into me. I did not know that this is noise, I need to take it out and take an independent decision. I showed you last time a tool whereby you can yourself make an assessment where the market is, right? I hope you have downloaded that file and seen that video, right? It gives you a good assessment where you are, right? Now, in the absence of such a tool, I would fall prey to such suggestions. And then it prompted my action of selling when that was the worst time to sell, right? So, therefore, we have to create our own tools so that we are able to filter. So one, we need to reduce the overload of information. And one of the things, I have a suggestion later that, for example, what I have done, you can also think of, is you can set Gmail alerts on specific information that you are targeting. So I don't even get a business newspaper in my house, right? I don't keep on watching portals about information, but I do get information through alerts on the companies that I track, right? And you can customize those alerts whereby a video of a leader is uploaded. I mean, a business leader is uploaded, you can always get an alert. You can set, the periodicity of those alerts. You want weekly, monthly, daily, you can set that. So you get to know what's happening in the companies that you are invested in, right? But you are able to avoid a lot of noise. The other noise which happens is during the quarterly results declarations, right? A lot of people take investment decisions looking at the quarterly results. And they find that, 40% is the jump in profits. They place a buy order. Who is selling? People who had already anticipated that the profit is going to go up by 40%. And they had invested 2 months earlier. So they are looking at an opportunity to exit. Who becomes the fodder? We who look at the quarterly results and take a buying decision. So quarterly results is too late an information to take an investing decisions. But sometimes people use this information, and that's actually noise. That's something which should be ignored, right? On the other hand, we should start observing how the stock price behaves in anticipation of corporate events. For example, a board meeting which is going to take place for declaration or dividend declaration, how has the stock price moved? If it has already moved up in certain anticipation, it is quite likely that a lot of expectation about what is going to come out in the results is already factored, right? And there are a set of people who are much better informed than us, right? So we'll talk about that piece a little more. Mind management and cash management are two very critical aspects which are often ignored. Mind management I have already spoken about, that how to manage the mind monkey, both on the greed side as well as on the fear side. I didn't elaborate on the greed side, but quite often retail investors, so there is also a confused positioning about investing, right? So sometimes people who are actually serious investors, who are not traders, get into what is called as momentum investing. Because there is a good momentum in a stock, they tend to get into buying that stock, right? So here what happens is, we are mixing up 2-3 different ideas. And I'm going to elaborate on this value versus price aspect more in detail. So I'm not saying per se buying on momentum is wrong, provided you have a conviction about value versus price paradigm. But if you're just buying because there is a momentum, you could be trapped, right? So this is something we have to be very careful on the greed side. When it comes to cash management, like I explained in session 2, there are easy ways of creating portfolios. For example, I had explained last time that a money market fund and an index fund are sufficient for you to build a good portfolio and generate very good returns. Of course, today we're going to talk about what are the different ways possible to improve our returns. But I'm just rekindling our discussion last time. So if you have money in your money market fund, it is not locked like your time deposit, right? If you have money in your time deposit, one of the problems is that it does not help you in your cash management. Because when you start saying, oh, if I were to break this deposit now, I'm going to lose so much of interest. So might as well not do it, right? So one of the reasons I didn't have money in time deposits is because of this cash management issue. In my view, time deposit should be used more as a cash management product rather than a serious investment. Bankers, I apologize, right? But the point I'm making is, when I had time deposits, I don't have any now. When I had time deposits, I would put my time deposits to manage my monthly commitments of credit card dues, and so I would have time deposits which will mature. So every 1st April, I'll keep 12 time deposits which will mature on 25th of the month, because 26th, my credit card bill is going to come and hit me. So I don't have to worry about whether I'll have enough money. So I was using it more as a cash management product, not as a serious investment product. But if I want to be agile from an investment perspective, I need to have access to cash, like whenever I need. So maybe next time I'll explain to you how there were opportunities during the COVID times also. And I have already created a video and I'll share a link, but that perspective of that video was slightly different. And next time I'll show you data in terms of how the prices moved of certain stocks. Again, the reason I don't name any stocks is because, it's best that, we take our own judgment call, because I wouldn't know who has invested based on, whatever names I have taken, and I may exit from that stock. So it's not fair on my part to name. Secondly, I respect SEBI regulations, that people who have been approved and registered as portfolio managers are the ones who are authorized to talk about it. So any of my videos, I have not talked about companies. Next time, I will talk about certain names of companies, but more from a certain universe perspective. I will not talk about which of those I hold, but I'll give you a universe of stocks. Again, there is a video already on this on YouTube, but very briefly, I'll give you that universe just as a thought for you to think about how you could think of investing from that particular perspective. That's where I'm just going to name them, but not that all of them which I'm going to name I have in my portfolio, right? So that time I'll tell you how the cash management part was critical for me to take quick investment decisions which were thrown by COVID situation also, right? And I'll explain to you with data next time. Okay, so I'll include a slide on it, which will give you a perspective of why cash management is important. Because when you have an opportunity, you must have ready cash to be able to invest. There are other ways of creating cash, which also I'll explain with that same example in the context of value versus price paradigm. So if you don't have investable money, for example, in my case, 2% is in fixed income, 2% in gold, so there is no cash available with me today. But still, I continue to invest by divesting something where I have a better value versus price paradigm, which I'll explain next time with examples. The last one is very critical. The last one is we must understand our limitations as retail investors. One of the problems is that we become overconfident with our ability of investing. That we have so much information about so many companies. So like I mentioned in one of the early sessions, I call this as party talk investing, which means I'm able to throw information about 100 companies, but that's not sufficient for anybody to take an investment decision. Least I would be able to take any investment decision on it, except saying that, sales of this company went up, or profits nosedived, whatever that is. But that's not sufficient for me to take an investment decision. Rather, it is important that I have a small portfolio which actually generates a better return than me throwing, names in front of friends. How does it matter, right? So this is where if we are aware about our limitations as retail investors, we can do better. We are not overconfident about our ability to generate better returns. We become more practical, and that is very critical. The last point, as I've already explained, we all need to understand this animal called as market, the way this market behaves. Why does fear creep in? Why does greed creep in? Last time I mentioned about the pendulum moving in both directions, right? Which is the nature of the markets. And that's where we have to be cautious. And that's the reason why I have in principle opposition against SIP as a way of investing. Because SIP takes my right to think. Whereas if I am able to observe what is going on in the market, I can actually put money to work when that is the right time and stay away from investing when that's not the right time, right? Or create a disciplined way of putting money to work, even in a very uncertain situation like COVID. The video that I created about my strategy about investing was on April 4, 2020, not 21. April 4, 2020. I will share a link this time with my video. So you can actually see how I looked at the emerging COVID situation and how I created a strategy for my own mind management and cash management, right? You can actually see because we were in the early stage of COVID pandemic that time, right? So it is not that it was an afterthought, and I actually implemented that strategy and it worked well. So just as a matter of learning, just to get a perspective, there are of course much better analysts and much better fund managers, but since we now practically become like a family, we have been meeting 3 times, and the next time I'm just sharing some of these things may be of use to you in creating a perspective which works for yourself. That was the idea. So this animal called as market, right? One thing very interesting about this animal is markets are supposed to be all-knowing and all-powerful, right? The collective knowledge which exists in the market is 1 crore times the knowledge that I have, right? But interestingly, which is good for us, there are pockets of ignorance in the market. People lose sight of some fundamental issues, and that's how a supply keeps on coming into the market, right? And you wonder whether you are making a mistake buying it. Just say, I bought a stock in 2019 before all this COVID issue happened. So my wife used to jokingly ask me, "Bhai, tu sure hai na? Because you are buying this stock as if, So I said, yeah, I have clarity about why I am buying this. It's become 4 times in 2 years, right? So it was not that I had some information which public didn't have, market didn't have, right? But people lose track of the fundamental reason why they have invested. If you are clear about why, what is the fundamental reason why you have invested, you will not sell that stock, or you would rather use that opportunity to accumulate, right? Again, this accumulation is not based on averaging principle. I had made a reference in session 1 about why averaging is a bad idea, but I'll touch upon that again today because some of you may not be there in session 1 or may not have had a chance to look at the video. So what works for us as retail investors is these pockets of ignorance. So if you are able to identify these pockets of ignorance, you know, sometimes people get blinded by, oops, I'm sorry. People get blinded sometimes, and they have, they lose sight of some information. That is a great opportunity for you to continue to buy, right? Through conviction, because you are convinced about why that's a great value. So these pockets of ignorance is something that we should use. The other thing we have already, oops. Mentality which is at work creates pendulum-like behavior. Markets tend to go up much more than the reality, and markets tend to fall much below what is really expected. So, like during these COVID times, the market collapsed by 50%, as if the whole economy is going to shrink forever by 50%. I remember a friend of mine who is a chartered accountant and who is also a financial advisor. He had called me up, young guy, just entered this profession a few years ago. So he was saying that, look, all the factories are closed. What is our justification of value of a company? My question to him was, why do you think that they are going to be forever closed? That's really the issue, right? If they're not going to be forever closed, this destruction in price which has happened is actually a great opportunity for us to buy, right? So that's the way we need to look at it. The fear takes it to an extreme. People think much beyond, what the reality is. So even in the worst situation of the market, if you see, I'm saying market in the economy, in that Q1, which was very bad of 2021, the economy shrunk only by 25%, even in the worst situation. But the market had fallen by 50%. Now this is an extreme behavior, and that is an opportunity for us if we can be on the right side of fear. Like I told you, in my first attempt at investing, I was on the wrong side of fear. But if you are on the right side of fear, you have an opportunity to multiply your money without really putting extra effort, right? So this animal called as market can become very painful for those who choose not to observe it, and it can be very rewarding for people who wish to learn to take advantage of it. So when you have, like I gave you example last time when we talked about index fund and money market fund which can be used, demonetization had created an irrational fear, right? And that irrational fear gave you an opportunity to buy an index fund at the bottom of 2016, November, December, which gave you a more than 30% return in 1 year, 3 months, right? More than 30%, 7,900 Nifty crossing 11,300. You can actually see the amount of return it actually gave that time. So the point is that we have these opportunities, and once we start understanding how this market works, now I think there are some, I'm sure there are some technical experts also, and that's where the whole Dow theory of is looked at, and you have high tides and low tides, right? Now, I'll also tell you another very interesting anecdote, and I have some batchmates here also, that in 1981, our college had a picnic to Gorai Beach, okay? And I don't know, were you there in that picnic? And a friend of mine who is now a senior counsel in Supreme Court, Vinay and I, we entered the sea actually. It was a beach that I had been for the first time, and we entered the sea. Without we realizing, after about 10 minutes, when we turned back, everybody was looking like a tiny dot on the beach, And then I said, Vinay, have you realized how far we have come in? And then we managed to go back, and thankfully there was no incidents. But I realized later on that I had entered the sea after the high tide was over and the low tide was building up. So during a low tide, you get pulled into the sea. This would have been a low risk if we were at the top of a low tide and the high tide was building up. Then we would have been thrown back to the shore without any discomfort. But when we entered the sea, it was a wrong time to make an entry. This is what exactly happens in the markets. If you have invested at the top of a market and the low tide sets in, you can, kind of get sucked in, which is what actually happened with me in 2008, 2009. So once we start understanding where the market is, that's where I gradually started developing a tool which I have shared in that video in terms of how to assess the levels of the market in the context of the economy. So if the economy is growing, there is no doubt that the markets are going to grow. Because finally, market growth is linked to the economic growth. If there is something which is happening which is damaging the economic growth potential of an economy, then we have to be really concerned about. But if there is nothing fundamentally happening in terms of damaging the economic growth potential of an economy, the markets will of course go through these pendulum kind of movement, but your long-term trend is very well protected. So once we know that we can take advantage of the market movement, it can be very rewarding. And that's where we need to learn that art. So this is something that continuously we have to practice. I also keep on learning it all the time. So that is the beauty of the markets as well, that it gives you a learning opportunity all the time. You have learned something, but you find that there is another perspective to it. So it becomes more and more rich. At the same time, this is something very interesting. The last one. Market as an animal can try our patience sometimes. So there is a stock, like I mentioned last time. I'm buying it, I'm buying it, I'm buying it, I'm buying it. The market is not discovering its true value, and therefore it is not reflecting in the price performance. And it may continue to try my patience for some more time. Like this stock, which is multiplied 4 times, was trying the patience in 2019, right? There was no explainable reason why it had fallen, but it was stuck at a lower corridor, and it gave an extended opportunity to continue to buy it. And you would wonder why the market is not discovering the obvious. So it can happen. But if you are convinced that there is a serious value in this, you can remain invested, and then the returns multiply. So this is very interesting. If the downward pressure on a float, imagine a float, you're trying to push it under water, right? Artificially by applying pressure onto it. If you apply more pressure on it and it has gone down in the water level, a day will come when that pressure is removed, it will bounce back far more than if there was only a gentle pressure, right? This is what exactly works with stocks as well, where the value versus price paradigm, about which I'm going to talk about later, when it has become compelling, but the market may not immediately realize. You are realizing the value versus price potential of a stock, and you may have to continue to buy it. You may see that nothing is happening with the price. And if you think that the framework of your investing is right, it may try your patience, but a day will come when it will rise so significantly that it will surprise you, right? And that time, the care that we have to take is that we should not exit too early, right? Because then the other mistake which happens is it has not been moving for so long, then it jumps 20% and we get into selling it. Then we realize that it has doubled. Because as I mentioned last time in the context of time value, you have a price correction and you also have a time correction. So we have to observe what kind of correction has happened, right? And when that correction starts getting reversed, the jump can be terrific. And we should be able to cash on to that jump as well. So understanding limitations of retail investors, first of all, I think we should accept that we have limited time that we can spare for investing. While investing is very critical, but our day-to-day professional or personal or family responsibilities do not allow us to be extravagant with time. And some of you may be even socially active, it constrains it further because you are also trying to contribute to the society, right? So you have limited time. Once we accept that, we are able to create strategies of how to get the best out of our time. Second is, I have already mentioned. Thirdly, in spite of all your efforts, right, as retail investors, even in the companies that I have invested in, I don't claim that I have more than 1/3 of the information than what really exists about that company, right? Because the world of companies has two sides of the same coin. Limited liability, so we can sleep peacefully that we have invested in a company, and the worst that can happen is our investment can go down in value, but no banker can write to us claiming a share of the loans that were given to the company, but the company is not repaying. We don't have to worry about that. But the other side of that coin of limited liability is limited rights. We have very limited rights, right? You can't cross the bar of public and non-public information. You can't ask for information which is not in the quarterly results, which is not in the annual report. You can seek explanations, but you cannot seek any fresh information that is not in the public domain. So it constrains our information availability to only about 1/3 at the most as a retail investor. Even in the stocks that I have, I don't claim more than 1/3 of information. Now, this is something it's good to be realistic about. Otherwise, we start thinking that we have a lot of information to be able to take aggressive decisions, right? So we have to be defensive for this reason. There are clearly some investors who are better informed than us. So next time also I'll talk about insider trades and how to track them, right? We should be able to track insider trades. What are insider trades? I would like to make a distinction between insider trading and insider trades. The two things are different. Insider trading is an offense. It's a criminal offense. If I have information, so for example, I have delivered training programs for more than 70 companies, right? So one of the aspects of code of conduct for myself is that after I have delivered a workshop for a company, I would not invest in that stock for at least 18 months after I have conducted a workshop, right? That's the self-imposed code of conduct, because nobody should say that, hey, you had an inside information that you acted on, right? The tips business which used to go on in the past was actually insider trading, where you have inside information about the company and you are merrily sharing with people and others are taking advantage of. That is insider trading. That's offense. But what are insider trades? Insider trades are purchases and sales done by individuals who are in the senior management of the company or who are a part of the board without breaching the insider trading norms. Whatever trades they have done, all those trades are required to be reported on through the exchange. So, do any of you track those insider trades before you buy or sell a share? Now, that's very critical, right? Why do I say this? If an insider who is better informed than you is selling the share and you find, that reported on to the BSE or NSE website, it will be, not really right for you to go and invest when somebody has a better understanding of value about that company. But if it's a stray trade, like for example, an employee is leaving that organization, right? And therefore, he or she is selling whatever shares he or she had. Maybe that was a requirement, like what we recently saw about one major private sector bank where an MD who really created he's a big name in banking. He sold a lot of his stocks after he exited. Now that created a question mark whether the bank is likely to go down the drain because of his exit. But there may be some contractual obligations on him not to continue to hold that stock. We don't know about it. But there was that insider trade which was declared. It was not strictly an insider trade, but an exit of an important insider sold his stock, right? So that was a stray event, but if you find consistently the insiders are selling it, it puts a question mark on your ability to assess value of that stock, right? I hope my point is clear. If not, we can do it as a part of the Q&A. So when some investors are better informed than us, we should not make the mistake of over-judging the value. Now, this is where I think I had mentioned, or maybe I had shared that video with you. Whenever there is an IPO, we have to analyze how much is the IPO portion of this and how much is the OFS portion of this. Does anybody track this gap between or the difference between IPO and OFS? OFS is an offer for sale by early investors who were waiting for the shares to be listed, right? So they invested early and they are selling now. So the company is not going to get any money towards that portion which is being sold to you. Who is going to get the money? People who had earlier bought are going to get the money and they are going to deliver their shares to you. The IPO is the only portion where the company is going to get the money and the company is going to issue new shares to you. Now, if as a part of an IPO, the overwhelming portion is of OFS, it gives you a signal that people who are better informed about the company, who, and I'll touch upon this aspect again in few minutes, better informed people are selling the shares. So you have to think whether you should go and buy. If you have limited information with you, much less than what those people in the know have, and if they are selling the shares at a particular price, is it right for you to go and buy it? Is a question that we need to ask ourselves, right? Now, this is the reason why I feel that defensive strategies are important. This is where I said that learn to manage the risk and the return will be a byproduct. Is for this same reason, because of all these limitations, about which we'll elaborate next time also. So as I mentioned, I'll not elaborate this point. Sometimes our value judgment could be tested by the market. Like I gave you the example of a stock which I was buying in 2019. Market did not discover the value and therefore the price was low. So sometimes it tests whether you really have understood its value. So you have to go and do the cross check, keep track of information. Once you are convinced, you continue to buy, right? So sometimes the market may not discover value. The price, apart from other things, apart from value, is also a function of cash flows. What do I mean by cash flows? I'm not talking about analysis of cash flow statement of the company. I'm talking about the fact that prices go up because cash flows are moving into that stock. More money is moving into that stock. And the drivers of money coming into the stock is because it is now perhaps coming into analyst radars, or there are some buy calls being made and more money starts moving there, right? So you may find that in some of your stocks, the price has moved up more than what you expected, right? But in some stocks, it can lag behind what you genuinely think is the value. But as far as you are convinced, you should continue to buy, is my view, as far as you are convinced about the value, and ignore the testing which is done by the market. So, accepting our limitations, what is that we can do to better our returns? So let's now talk about these avenues that we have. The earlier three avenues are mutual fund based. The later three avenues are individual shares based. So I'll not elaborate this too much because those of you who have been there in the last session or who may like to see the video, I had already mentioned this, why I personally like the index fund idea, because there are a majority of mutual funds, 80 to 90%, depending on which country and which market you are looking at, but at the minimum 80, at the maximum 92%, underperform an index. So there is a high probability that I invest into a mutual fund and it falls into this category, right? There is a small probability that you fall into the third category, which is better performing mutual funds. But even they require close monitoring. If a fund manager who was performing very well, he or she leaves that organization or stops performing as well, you may actually find that a stock which gave excellent, or a fund which gave excellent returns in the past is no longer delivering good returns. So to eliminate this fund manager risk, I always suggest that we look at an index fund on the top 50 stocks, which is an index fund based on Nifty. So, and I had shown you data also last time. Those who missed it can see the last time's video where I had also shown data about economic growth and the returns delivered by Nifty. And then we use that for assessing the market levels. Now let us come to the lower portion, which is where we get into stock investing. What are the options that we have as retail investors? It will not be appropriate for me to have an ego that I can beat a fund manager, right? Because the fund manager has far more information at his or her disposal than I have. It is his or her full-time profession to manage funds. It's not my full-time profession to manage funds, right? I'm busy doing a few other things, and then I also manage my funds. So then what is the practical situation that I can take? One way of doing this, I create a smaller portfolio, right? A smaller portfolio, like I disclosed, I have only 5 stocks. So I have a very small portfolio to monitor. But the downside risk of that is concentration on a few stocks, right? And then you have to be really convinced that this is performing. Act quickly if you think, your assessment of value of that stock is challenged. You have to very quickly exit, right? So watching for the concentration risk is very important. Now, next time I'll explain, out of these 5 stocks, I have 3 stocks which fall into a category which help me to diversify. So that I'm going to explain next time, that without increasing the number of stocks, I can create a diversified portfolio with only 3 stocks. How, we are going to discuss next time, right? And again, I already have a video on this. So you can create a smaller purposeful portfolio where you can practically monitor these companies better. Second way is you can start looking at sectors. Suppose you have expertise in a particular sector and you find that there are companies which are in that sector which you can understand, you can analyze, and they're under-researched. What do I mean by under-researched? Typically, they are not on the radar of any research analyst, a typical equity broking house who employ these research analysts to analyze these stocks. So an under-researched stock has the potential of generating superior returns. Like these 2 other stocks that I have, I actually had only 1 stock. It got demerged and it has created wonderful opportunities, right? Because I was tracking it, it started creating a new business division, it demerged, and a stock which I had bought in 2013 also at various prices at 12 rupees, after demerger, that demerged stock has gone up to 1350 now. It's a matter of 8-9 years. So it can actually give you phenomenal returns if you are identifying an under-researched stock, right? The last one is that even within your portfolio, if you have a compact portfolio, you can create what I call as positional trades. This is not trading, but once you start understanding the way pendulum moves, you can exit from a stock out of your portfolio, part exit, not full exit. It could be 2%, 5% of your portfolio. Use that money to buy something else within that universe of 5 stocks, which is what I did during this COVID situation. I'll show you the data, right? How you can actually create those opportunities for you. Because you have limited number of stocks, you can actually observe the way they move, and therefore you also have a much better handle on the value price paradigm, and therefore you create opportunities for yourself to get that extra return than if you were to just hold on to those investments without doing anything, right? This may mean, as I mentioned last time also, you paying tax. But paying tax is not a mind block. As far as you are willing to pay tax and take advantage of that price movement, tax is a reasonable cost to pay and take advantage of a compelling value somewhere else, right? Okay, so we saw a number of charts that time and saw some trends. And the good thing about this chart, like the chart of gold, is that this is in a perennial bull market. Why is it in a perennial bull market? Because the economy is in a perennial bull market. So why is the stock market always going to give you positive returns over a period of time, except the shocks which may happen? So if we are able to create a mindset of not succumbing to those shocks, and if we are able to create mind management tools, some of which I'll explain next time also, then what you are protecting is the upside that you have, right? So if you protect yourself from a downside risk, the upside risk is almost, upside returns are almost assured, for the simple reason that equity markets are closely linked with economy. So as far as the economy has tremendous growth potential, investing in stocks makes tremendous sense. Now, the movements that can happen, if we create a tool like what I shared with you last time, you can also start assessing whether we are in an overheated situation, right? And I explained last time that it's not my view that we are in an overheated situation. When I created that video in August, Nifty was at about 16,750 when I created that video. And in that video also I had said, given the rationale, and there is a downloadable Excel file for those of you who would like to keep that with yourself and keep on, checking for yourself. We have to ensure that we are in a reasonable level, right? If we are in a reasonable level, we can definitely be bullish on the economy. So does the Indian economy hold the potential of generating returns for equities? The answer is clearly yes, right? And therefore, that itself is a merit for remaining invested in equities and gradually increase our exposure to equities. So some of the mistakes I have already elaborated, so I will not dwell too much into it. I am just conscious of the time. So getting scared on market falls, exit in fear and desperation, succumbing to greed, buying stocks on analyst recommendations, tips not on study or conviction. Fourth one I'll elaborate, not selling at all, falling in love with your investments, right, is something I have not touched upon. Personally, I feel that the discipline of exit is a very important discipline. Not just access to exit, but actually exiting is a very good discipline, right? Because once you do that, you're also creating benchmarks for yourself for your future investing. For example, if I have sold a stock today at X price and I get that opportunity to buy that stock again because of either time correction or price correction, or even if the price remains flat, after 1.5 or 2 years, I'm already getting it cheap, right? So for me to create a benchmark, of course, when we create that benchmark, we have to also take into account the tax aspect of it. So, that's not an issue, but once we do that, it also helps us to take our further purchase decisions. And this is something I'll explain to you next time when I'm actually going to give you data in terms of how an exit in June created a great opportunity for me to enter aggressively in October, right? In the same stock. I'm talking about 2020. And the kind of returns it has given. So I redeemed all my liquid funds, whatever I had, about 40 lakhs in a single day, paid tax on it and invested aggressively. It has now given about 130% returns in about 15 months, less than that, right? So those opportunities we need to exploit out of conviction. And only because I was able to sell in June, I could take that buying decision, because it had already created a framework for me to take a buy decision. Because I had already exited at a price of 2850, 2250 as a price after 4 months was an extremely attractive price to enter back, because the value was protected. But I had already sold at 2850. So buying back that stock at 2250 was a wonderful opportunity, because I had both a time correction and a price correction. So I was getting it cheap, and I was getting it cheap 4 months later. So I was saving both ways, right? So sometimes you have to take those decisions, and therefore selling is a great discipline. Rupee cost averaging. I'll talk about this in few minutes. The last one is buying such a large number of assets. We have had CA elections yesterday and today. So I had gone for casting my vote yesterday, and I met a CA friend, and who told me that he has 200 stocks, right? Now, I don't know what kind of buying and selling decisions he would be taking, which to buy and which to sell, right? So creating such a large number of assets, right, that you can't monitor, and it's impossible to monitor, it's impossible to take exit decisions, right? So therefore, it is much better that we create limited number of assets while being mindful of concentration risk. And I'll explain next time how I can still create a diversification strategy with limited number of stocks, so which I'll explain next time to you with actual examples. The last one is mixing up investing with trading, right? Worse, speculation. So an investor becomes a trader a trader becomes an investor suddenly. Of course, we have some great names who have done both very successfully, but they are focused fully on it. For people like you and me who have other professions to take care of, it is much better to wear one hat and do justice to it, is my submission. Of course, some of you can manage both, but I have stayed away from trading. I have stayed away, of course, from speculation. Now, what is speculation? Speculation is not being clear about the value, right? Not being clear about the value proposition. So if you're not clear about the value proposition, anything that you buy is speculation, right? Okay. Now, this is something I wanted to discuss quickly. I think I had touched upon it earlier. Let us be very clear about these three ideas: value, price, and cost. Value is something which is subjective. We need to make an assessment of value. I have one slide where I'll talk about this valuation part, but I have detailed videos which I'll share with you in the description, right? So value is subjective. Price is what is prevailing in the market. Value is something that we need to make an assessment and develop our own judgment. Price is what is prevailing right now, and cost is the price that prevailed some time ago in history, right? Now, the whole averaging strategy is based on price versus cost. So let me elaborate this. Suppose you have been buying a particular share for many years or many months, and your average cost of a particular share is, say, 150 rupees, just for an example. You take a decision to buy that share because you find that the price today is 100 rupees, and this will give you an opportunity to reduce your average cost. That is quite often cited as a reason to buy a stock. Now, to my mind, the mistake is here we have thrown value outside the equation. We are only focused on price and cost. What are we saying? Price is 100 rupees, my average cost is 150 rupees. So therefore, it is a compelling buy. The simple investing decision is not about price and cost. It is about value versus price. So I would buy that stock. Like I told you, I was continuing to buy in 2019. The price at which I was buying was much lower than my average cost. But I was not buying because I wanted to reduce the average cost. I was buying because the value versus price was very compelling. So you can very well buy if you are convinced about value, and reduced average is a byproduct or result. But don't buy to reduce your average. If you do that and throw the value part out of the equation, then what is going to happen is the price can go lower and lower, right? That's the risk. Low can get lower. It is also called as a falling sword. If you try and hold it, it is going to bleed you, right? So you continue to buy, say, a Jet Airways or a Kingfisher because the price is lower than your average cost, is going to hurt you. So you have to, anytime you are making an assessment for buying anything, it is always required to be between value versus price and not price versus cost. So this is something I just wanted to submit. So this obsession with cost is a very big cause of risk. Cost is just for a record for you. Even for tax purposes, your average cost is irrelevant. It is your first in, first out that matters anyway. So your average cost is just a number for you to know, but it's not a decision point. So I have already mentioned this, that invest where value versus price gap, in your view, is the maximum. And wherever you think there is a destruction of value, don't hesitate to exit, right? If value is something that you're not able to assess. Like I think I gave an example of me attending an AGM of a company. Did I give this example? That I attended and I found that there was question marks about the value. I exited the AGM. First thing I did was I sold all my 8,000 shares, right? And I find that it is unlisted now, delisted, right? For non-compliance reasons, not because of a choice of delisting, right? So once you have a question mark about value, it's much better that you exit, because finally it's your hard-earned money, right? That's really the test. So once we have a better handle on this value versus price, as I'm going to show you next time, it actually gives you wonderful opportunities to switch money from one stock to another, because where you find that value versus price is more compelling without necessarily putting new money to work, you can also switch money, and that also gives you an additional return. Now, very quickly, I will talk about the valuation aspects. There are various methods of valuation. Simply stated, valuation or estimating value is really estimating the intrinsic potential of an asset to generate a return better than your expectation. So, typically a venture capitalist would be able to invest in startups because they have a better judgment on their ability to generate a superior value. But I, as a retail investor, would stay away from it because I am not equipped to make an assessment like they are able to make an assessment, right? So, basically, we are trying to assess the intrinsic potential of an asset to beat our return expectation. Last time we took an example of real estate, that if you are actually investing in a real estate, and I hope you have been able to download that Excel file and study it more. So various approaches are possible. Like there was a question which was asked in the session 1. There are various methods. I'll not elaborate here. I have videos on each one of them. I will share in the description box of this video when it is uploaded. On each of these, I have videos, so you can see them. Cash flow based approaches are possible. Relative valuation to peers, which is where we use the price earnings or EV EBITDA kind of frameworks, and asset based valuation. So in cash flow based, like what the research analysts who are paid to do analysis do, they do detailed modeling, right? They actually model a company. They model the future cash flows of the company, future P&L, balance sheet, the expansion needs, the borrowings that the company is going to do, and they get into a very detailed modeling, which is not possible for us. So what is possible for us is we can do, easier models which are based on dividend expectations. So again, I have created videos on this in terms of simple models which talk about growth in dividend and how that can be used for estimating the value of a stock, right? So I will share videos there. Relative valuation to peers. Price earnings ratio is a popular measure. But what I would also suggest, and I have again videos on that, is instead of just looking at price earnings, you should look at price earnings with reference to growth. So what is much better to see is PEG ratio, or what is also called as power PE ratio, rather than just the PE ratio. So PE ratio, for example, is your price divided by earning per share. Suppose it comes to 18. Now, is it good or bad? You can do a relative comparison with other players in the market. Or what you can also say is, what is the growth potential of this company? Is it likely to generate 20% return in terms of earnings? Then the power PE is 18 divided by 20. And 18 divided by 20 is 0.9. Anything which is closer to 1 is a reasonable PE, right? So it is not just PE which is relevant, it is the PE with reference to G, PEG or power PE ratio which is relevant. So all these I have discussed in the videos. EV EBITDA ratio, enterprise value to EBITDA is again another metric. Again, I have a video on this which you can see. I also have videos with examples. How do you use PE framework? How do you use EV EBITDA framework? So all those I will provide in the this video's description box. And the last one are asset-based valuation. Now here, something wonderful that can happen is the underlying which can generate value, which can be real estate or strategic stakes in other companies. So this is something I'm going to elaborate in the next session, particularly the last one, investment stakes in other companies, with some of these companies which can be used by you as a diversification method, which I'll explain next time, right? Now, very briefly, I want to touch upon, again, I have a detailed video on this, what I'm going to talk about, which is the value drivers of a company. What really creates a potential for a company to deliver superior value year after year? What are those parameters? You will see that it's slide full, actually. So I'm not going to elaborate the whole framework today. We don't have the time. But I have a detailed video on this, which is about 35-40 minutes in terms of how do you make an assessment. So even in these 3 companies that I have invested, which are investment and holding companies, where I don't have to directly track those companies, but I have to track the underlying companies in which they have taken stakes. And I'll elaborate this next time. I don't track, so there are no investor calls which are taking place as far as the companies that I directly invest in, but I attend the investor calls of the companies that they have invested in. Because the value of what I'm investing depends on their investments, right? So if their investments are likely to do well or not is going to drive the value and price performance of the companies that I have invested in. So I have to use a framework to make an assessment whether those companies are equipped to continue to deliver value. So this is where a limited number of companies are easier to track. So what I'm talking about are a few parameters, but in the video you will find that each of those parameters, so first is product portfolio. What kind of products do they have, right? Now, this has been elaborated into various components in the video. So what do we look at when we are looking at product portfolio? For example, product differentiation is something very important. Is this company creating differentiated products, or is it in a Me Too business, which is all commoditized? If it is differentiated, it will have pricing power. If it is in a commoditized business, it will not have pricing power. So therefore, product portfolio is something very important. And does this company have an ability to continue to create its products? You know, so it can make its own products outdated and come out with new products. So product portfolio is a very important aspect that we have to look at when we are looking at a company. The second one are the growth drivers. What is that is going to help this company to continue to grow? So for example, that the good thing about Indian companies is now they are crossing the shores of India, right? They are getting into newer markets. So if the companies are getting into newer markets, it has growth drivers, because the Indian market can get saturated, but they can move into other markets and continue to replicate what they are doing domestically. So this is growth drivers. Another growth driver which is potential is that they are in a particular segment, they can create product extensions, or they can get into a related segment, right? So what are the growth drivers? That's second important thing. Third very important thing is the operational efficiency, right? Here I'm going to take an example of a company which I don't own, so therefore I have no hesitation in taking an example. But if you look at Asian Paints as a company, it has refined its operational efficiency to a great level, whereby they can replenish the stocks of their dealers couple of times in a day. Imagine the level of efficiency. So at no point a dealer is out of stock, right? No time a customer will have an excuse of not getting the product that the customer was looking for, right? So operational efficiency is something very, very important. Again, there are multiple aspects to it, which I'm not elaborating right now. The fourth aspect is very important, is the ability to scale up. If the company has already reached a level where it needs to expand, but if its borrowings are so big that it does not have borrowing capacity left, then it is going to create a challenge in terms of its ability to scale up. Secondly, what we have to look at is, are they actively employing an outsourcing model, or they are trying to do everything themselves? If they are trying to do everything themselves, their ability to scale up is going to be restricted. But if they are outsourcing and working with a numerous set of partners more aggressively, their ability to service a market is going to be easy, and they can scale up very quickly. Because otherwise, even if they have a product, but if they can't really deliver the expanded needs of the market, then they are going to fall behind. So that's, in my view, is the fourth important aspect. Fifth is the financial management part of it, which includes its balance sheet management. That's where issues like buyback become very important, and I'll touch upon buyback next time. The next one is underlying assets, and lastly, what I call as hygiene factors. Hygiene factors are those which an organization needs to take care of on the back end. they include risk management, they include cost management, they include, some of the other aspects like talent retention. All those aspects become very critical. In fact, in ability to scale up, its talent practices are going to create a huge impact in their ability to scale up, because finally it's the talent which is going to help a company to scale up. If you don't have right talent, you don't have the right practices for engaging your own employees, you wouldn't be able to scale up so easily. So again, as I mentioned, I have a very detailed video on this, which I request you to see. I'll share a link. It has so many factors involved in it. So each one of them has been analyzed horizontally. So if you look at product portfolio, differentiated products, technology and research, profitability ratios, R&D expenses to sales, all these become very important for you to make an assessment whether the company is spending enough on technology to be able to create that product portfolio, right? If you're looking at operational efficiency, asset utilization, supply chain and distribution, all these things become very important. So I have elaborated each one of them into more details. Now, we don't have the time to discuss all of this, and not necessary because there is already a ready video which elaborates each of these aspects in great detail, which I'll provide as a part of the description box. So I wouldn't elaborate it too much. But the point is that when we are investing, if we invest in a limited number of stocks and convince ourselves about what the company is doing, that is a great step in reducing your risk, because then you build a conviction. So instead of developing understanding about 100 companies, I would rather try and develop a more detailed understanding of a limited number of companies. That is going to help me, because then I can allocate more. I can allocate with conviction. And our objective, which I defined today early, was not just to increase equity return, but allocate more money to well-performing companies while creating a defensive strategy, which I'm going to elaborate anyway next time. Very quickly, I have not yet created video on this, but this is something I just want to very quickly make a reference to, and that is about corporate governance, right? So what I would do is that in days to come, I will create a detailed video on what I think are typical corporate governance issues that we need to be mindful of. But very quickly, is it okay if I go on and elaborate this a little bit? Okay. So some of the issues I want to highlight, and the point I want to make is that don't go by any name that, such companies, to my mind, there is no blue chip. Okay? To me, every company needs to be analyzed from this perspective, because blue chip is a fiction that we have created in our own mind. Some of the best of the companies that I have personally experienced, I don't want to name, but I was extremely disappointed with, the way very reputed companies, when it comes to corporate governance, compromise when it comes to the personal interests of people at the helm. So I always say corporate governance have two layers. One is operational governance, and second is the real corporate governance, which is about how people behave, right? When it comes to their personal interests versus the corporate interests. Operational governance of many companies has excelled. There's no doubt. A lot of companies have worked well on improving their operational governance. But I can't say that with comfort about the upper piece, which is about conflict between personal interests of the people at the helm versus the overall interests of the investors, right? So some of the issues that arise include related party transactions. Particularly, you have to be very careful when you are investing in shares of a company where promoters have low stake in the company. So if set of promoters have, say, low, like 24-25% stake in the company and trying to run it, then this is a reasonably high risk, because they can create companies which are, they're private limited companies, 100% owned by them. For example, owning the real estate in the private companies and then leasing it out to a company where there is a 25% promoter stake and 75% is the public ownership. This is one example I'm saying. So related party transactions is one important issue. The second is about share issuance and transactions. Quite often, the timing of issuing stock options, right, is something which benefits the employees, no doubt, but it comes at the cost of the wider shareholder interest. Particularly, I was disappointed with a very reputed company. Again, I don't want to name. In their annual report, they are saying we want to raise the bar of corporate governance, and they issue stock options to themselves, to the employees, at the most severe point of fall of Lehman Brothers crisis. So stock price had fallen not because of the fact that you wanted to incentivize people to perform better and take it to new heights. It had fallen because of the market situation. You only took advantage of it. And in those days, there was no requirement of the independent directors not participating in stock options. So the chairman of the remuneration committee also participated in the stock options. So there was blatant conflicts of interest, right? Again, there was a concentration of stock options issuance to the highest levels, right? So this is an issue, and that diluted the earning per share for the investor community as a whole. This company would have never issued fresh shares, either by way of rights issue or any follow-on issue at that price at which stock options were issued, right? So one set of investors are benefiting at the cost of a wider set of stakeholders. Now this is something which we have to be careful. So share issuance, stock options, share issuance, the IPOs, right, or leverage buybacks. This is something I'll explain next time, how a buyback can be used by promoters to increase their stake without they putting a single rupee, right? This is something interesting. I'll explain it next time when we talk about buybacks, that promoters, without putting any money, they can increase the stake in the company. So how do we respond to such buybacks is something that we will talk about. Management vested interests, very aggressive compensations, right? Self-perpetuation, people don't want to retire, right? As if, now this is a failure of a company where they say that we can't create the next generation of leaders, so we have to remain stuck with that company, whether we are in 60s, 70s, we would be there, right? So this is something which is management vested interest, which we have to be also careful. Strategic view of business. Sometimes these independent directors are brought onto the board because they are eminent personalities, no doubt, but they may not have any expertise about that industry or business, right? So is there a body of directors who can really take an independent view of what is happening in the company is something that has to be seen. The other problem is short-termism versus long-term interests of the company. That's another issue, because sometimes a lot of decisions could be guided by short-term gains, but that can actually cause long-term challenges. The other problem, which is as a structure, is that the appointments which happen, of course the practices are improving now, mostly they are happening through referrals. So to say they are independent directors, but essentially it's not that they are unknown people, right? Ideally a model should be that the SEBI itself appoints independent directors and SEBI remunerates them. But right now the problem is that the independent directors are remunerated by the company, and that's where there is a bit of a conflict of interest in my view. So this is the point, aggressive remuneration to independent directors. Does that help them to really take an independent decision, or they get compromised because of the aggressive compensation that they receive as independent directors? Also, as I earlier mentioned, the lack of sufficient insight about the business, the value that the independent directors can bring to the table, and that itself can cause some governance issues. And as I mentioned, should the appointment model be tweaked, where instead of the company or the board appointing directors, should it be by an independent authority altogether? I think that needs debate. Or there should be better guidance on remuneration so that it does not create a conflict of interest. Otherwise, people take positions, because they don't have much to contribute, but they get fabulous compensations. And then there is a compromise, because if they are getting fabulous compensations, their motivation of stopping fabulous compensation to the executive directors is hardly there. So it can become you scratch my back and I scratch your back. So that's a clear risk, and we need to be aware about. Lastly, before I conclude, this is always a question that arises. So what we have been talking about so far is more in the domain of fundamental analysis. In the note which I am going to circulate at the end of the 4th session, now circulate in the sense, what I do is that in the 4th video, I will make available in a Google Drive a detailed learning note that you may like to download, right? So typically in fundamental analysis, what is done is you look at an industry, you look at the economy, you look at the industry, and you look at a company. Some of these aspects about a company I have captured through video, but some of the aspects which are equally important, but which I have not been able to capture necessarily as a part of the videos or in these discussions, I am going to capture them as a part of the learning note, right? And you can download that learning note. It will be 60-70 pages learning note. You can download and use it for your own reference. It will capture the learning right from our session 1. Okay, so that will also help you. So fundamental analysis is about understanding the economic events, trends, understanding the industry level factors, understanding the company dynamics and fundamentals, including the financial statements. So next time, what I'm going to particularly talk about are some of the important financial parameters that you should definitely look at, right? So I will create a slide on it, which is something which is very important. But I have a full series, I have not shared it here, but I have a full series of learning finance videos, a 50 set of videos on understanding balance sheets and how to analyze them, horizontal analysis, vertical analysis, ratio analysis. On all those there are videos. Cash flow statement is a very important statement, quite often underrated, not given the due importance. People get into analysis of P&L in the balance sheet, but not analyze cash flow statement. Cash flow statement analysis itself can give you some interesting insights. I have a video including examples of how do you look at a cash flow statement. So all those videos, probably in a description box, it will be too much to share all of them. But if you see on my channel, there is a playlist on learning finance, and you can pick and choose whatever videos you want to see. So value estimation modeling, where again I have videos which I'll share with you. Financial analysis, governance, insider activity, and use. They are all very important in investing decisions. Technical analysis, if you are able to supplement your core investing decisions with basic understanding of technical analysis. Of course, some of you may be experts in technical analysis, and that's very useful in trading. But even in investing decisions, basic understanding of charts does help, right? Technical analysis have a very different language. They talk about stop losses and all those. They look at the price patterns, volume, the market turning points, what is a good time of making an entry, etc. Sometimes they will not buy a stock unless some major crossovers happen, right? Whereas somebody who is following fundamental analysis can enter a stock even before a trader will enter a stock because of the conviction about value versus price. That's where there is a difference that me as a fundamental analyst may make an entry into a stock much earlier than what a trader would enter, because a trader would look for an important crossover to happen, the price crossing over certain important averages. Only then they will touch that stock. But I can enter a stock much earlier because of my conviction. So there are merits in both these methods. If we are able to, as investors, learn at least the basics of technical analysis, that definitely supplements. There is no doubt about that. Okay, so that's something I wanted to mention here before I would conclude today, and then we could continue a discussion in the next session. Of course, we'll be open for Q&A based on whatever we discussed today or in the last sessions, and then I look forward to a similar interaction in the next session. We will talk about various aspects which I have not been able to cover so far. I will touch upon them in the next session. Thank you for your wonderful participation so far. Yes.
you did refer to the analysis or study of the promoters quota while they are coming out with IPO and the difference, that is their stock holding if they are offering it to the public. Right. So my question is, when government is disinvesting, whether that is relevant? I think it should be irrelevant, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. So we need to look at these two with a different lens. Typically, when an OFS happens, in an OFS you will have small promoter exit, but a larger exit which will come from early investors like private equity investors who made an entry to strengthen the management at that time or strengthen the company which was in difficulty, and who have a clear vision for exit, and they want an exit within a certain defined time frame. So if we are paying a very high price, we should not do that unless we have very strong conviction of value. So if there are private equity investors and promoters themselves who are trying to encash, then they are people who have a much better assessment of value than me as a retail investor can be, and therefore we need to exercise caution. When government exits, government has a different reason for exiting. Government is not exiting for a value versus price reason. Government is exiting for a strategic reason, where their philosophy is that government is not in the business of running a business. So it is for that reason they want to exit, right? So therefore the motivations of these two people are different, and therefore I would not be so worried if it is the President of India who is exiting and we are buying, because the motivations are totally different. It's not because they have a poor judgment call on value because of which they are exiting, but they are exiting for a strategic reason. And of course, as like anyone who wants to exit, they would look at a good timing. So to that extent, such issues will come when markets are buoyant rather than when markets are in doldrums. So that is a natural thing which is happening. So to that extent, we will be paying a bit of a premium as compared to if that issue were to come when the market was in a down cycle. But that is something which we have to take in our stride. But it is better than the value versus price issue in case of companies from the private sector, where there could be issues about our value assessment.
We discussed about P by E ratio or EV by EBITDA. Is it fair enough to compare with the industries?
Yeah.
And if filter is to be applied, how many years? Because initially, some companies with the initially are misguiding. What can be that filter? 3 years, 5 years of operation?
Okay. Yes. So in my view, the P by B, which is price to book, becomes a major issue if you try and compare companies which are very old with companies which are very new. Because you will find that companies which are very old, price to book ratio could be staggeringly very high as compared to newer companies where price to book ratio will be much more modest. So if you are looking at price to book, you have to be very careful, because you can't take a valuation decision saying that, oh, a company has much higher price to book and therefore, its price is really beyond value, and therefore you should not take a wrong decision of exiting from there and entering into another stock where price to book ratio is low. Because that's where the age of the company would matter. Because an older company would have depreciated a lot of its assets, a newer company would not have done so. But in case of price earnings, it's not such a big risk. Because what you are really focusing on is the earning potential. Now here, when we look at a PE, it is not the trailing PE which is relevant. What is trailing PE? Trailing PE is the earnings per share are defined historically. That means last year's earning per share is used as a basis for P by E calculation, right? What is a better thing to do is to look at the forward PE. So what is forward PE? It is price divided by forecast earning for the ensuing year or for the following 1 or 2 years. Now that gives you a much better estimate, because as we will discuss next time, it is the play of leverage, right? Operating and financial leverage, which can increase the profits dramatically more than the sales, right? Or if the company is vulnerable, they can dramatically kill the company if the operating and financial leverages are very high. This is a learning that we all should have, and I'm going to include a slide next time to talk about these leverages, because at least some awareness about this leverage will give us a better handle on our investments. I don't know how many of you actually use operating and financial leverage as a part of your own analysis, but without much effort, you can easily do that analysis, and that gives you a good handle on, when to invest and when not to invest. So I will explain next time what happens with leverages. So therefore, P by E ratio, we need to look at from a future perspective in terms of how the earnings are likely based on the operating and financial leverages at play rather than just the historical data. Because historical data will not capture that dynamic, right? And I'll explain it next time how financial leverage and operating leverage can multiply profits if the company does well, or it can kill a company if the company does not do well. So therefore that aspect also has to be seen, and therefore I would not give too much of weightage in terms of the how old that company was. But that will become very important in price to book. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So no problem. I think do have a look at this video when we upload it. Do look at the other videos related to it. Particularly, I would request you to have a look at that video on various value drivers. And in case you have any questions next time about that, feel free to ask them. There I have dealt with various issues, including buyback as a part of that framework itself. Why do companies announce buyback? And what has that to do with balance sheet management of that company? But I'll also talk about buybacks next time in greater detail. Okay? So I look forward to seeing you next time.